So, as mentioned there, Professor Tom Macmillan sends his sincere apologies. He can't be with you today as scheduled, but he's looking after family members who all have COVID, unfortunately, and young, poorly children don't mix well with presentations, so interruptions were likely. However, he is listening in, so hello to you, Tom. He's asked me to talk about the UK perspective on policies to enable OFE. I run the Centre for Effective Innovation in Agriculture that Tom led, which is a 5-year initiative with academics coming together from across 5 of the top agri-research universities in England to help align public and private R&D investments with farmers' practical priorities. So the UK's story and trajectory on on-farm experimentation is of interest here because in some ways the UK is quite late to the party, and even within the UK, the devolved nations have developed at different speeds, really. Here are some of the main OFE-related initiatives in the UK. The funding and research communities have been very focused on the biosciences, with recent funding over the last sort of 8 years or so, and policy strategy focus given to precision agriculture and digital technologies. But OFE activities have been less related to digital technologies, as you can see in this chart, in actuality, activity happening on the ground. But there is still very tentative central support for farmer-centred or dispersed methods, largely leaving this to be taken care of by often charitably funded farmer-facing organisations and initiatives, or the presumption that we have a nation of educated farmers, so they should simply be adopting the fantastic innovations coming out of world-class research, which, of course, adoption doesn't work like that on many levels. Even the excellent and innovative agronomics used in the YEN network by ADAS and Innovative Farmers Farmer-led R&D programme have struggled to gain substantial public research funding. In England, the European Innovation Partnerships Programme struggled to achieve its goal due to policy, design and implementation failures in understanding how producers could realistically interact with it. Instead, other third sector initiatives have tried to address the gap, recognising that farmers were innovating in isolation and needed really useful and applied support to boost their activities. And the flexibility and responsiveness of charitable and farmer-centric approaches could have actually served to highlight just how the R&D and wider knowledge landscape, particularly in the UK, was disjointed and inefficient. Whereas in other devolved nations in the UK, there was greater success with public funding and support. For example, in Scotland, there was the Rural Innovation Support Service, and EIP Wales, implemented through Farming Connect, created much more inclusive and accessible platforms for farmers to interact with. But we are at an interesting moment post-Brexit, where the policy and innovation funding landscape is really being shaken up, arguably more than it could have been if our governments in the UK should have remained actually in Europe. The expectation in policy circles is that things should be done differently now, and there's a substantial shift in focus and funding for farmer-centred innovation in much of the agricultural transition plan for England. In red here is the biggest of the devolved nations. Then this year, the UK Innovation Strategy was released, talking about more effective implementation and integration of agri-innovation. And then there was the National Food Strategy Independent Review, which came up with a list of recommendations, but specifically that the Agricultural Transition Plan Fund should support a full spectrum of farmer-led approaches. We also have a development of a What Works Centre for Agriculture, seeking public support at the moment to try and defragment the knowledge exchange landscape. So as I mentioned, there are new opportunities, some of which are launching next week for OFE, with 280 million earmarked by the Department for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs as part of the post-Brexit Agricultural Transition Plan, with a focus shift on collaborative and farmer-led research and innovation, and opportunities for OFE projects and OFE infrastructure development are greater than they have been in the past. there are three pillars of funding that have been drawn up from small-scale agile projects that are similar to EIP Agri or Innovative Farmers Field Labs, where groups of farmers come together on quite pragmatic research trials based on their priorities, to large-scale themed focused projects that are very similar to previous agricultural innovation funding in the UK, but with more emphasis on strategic priorities such as net zero and practical experimentation. And the principle with this shift in funding is to reflect the developmental progression of R&D, although perhaps many of us here would argue that things aren't quite so linear and simple in practice. At least this has much more potential for an interconnected pathway and opportunities for positive feedback loops with OFE. For example, farmers and growers can start their innovation journey in accelerate adoption pillar in peer groups, studying something that matters to them directly. But over time, as their connections with researchers increase and their knowledge and their experimental skills grow, they can move through greater project complexity more easily. I like to think of it that their innovation potential only increases. And meanwhile, the very existence of producers being at the heart of projects means that there's greater potential for impact across R&D strata. I highlight here completely new territory for public funders in England, where a pilot fund has been created to help farmers and growers with ambitious ideas get funding to get a project team and a plan together in order to hopefully apply for money to then do the project later, apply for funding to do the project thereafter. And this is similar to the successful Rural Innovation Support Service run in Scotland that I mentioned before, that provided support for the exploration of farmer-led research ideas to project development. So the headlines and ambitions are really positive, but how effectively it will really support OFE and other farmer-centred approaches will depend on how the policies and funds are designed. And this is a big part of what our Centre for Effective Innovation in Agriculture focuses on, using the collective expertise in the centre from agricultural economists. I think we have James Loberg de Boer, he's one of our board members, for example. We have user-centred design expertise and academic leadership across multiple sectors and internationally that help advise on fund design, learning lessons from the past, but also acting as a funnel for our varied networks from farming organisations through industry and academia to help try and ensure that policy and fund design can maximise the potential for impact that the ambitions describe, designing agricultural R&D funding to support real-world innovation. Experience of previous OFE and farm-led initiatives suggests key factors that must be included. So one is a focus on pre-competitive and collaborative projects. This really does make it front of mind for farmers, and it also helps avoid a lot of the IP knots that projects can get themselves caught up in. And with that, low-level funding per project minimises bureaucracy and risk, and it's compatible with a streamlined application process. High funding levels can seem just too risky, and partners have very high liability. A high funding rate you can achieve assuming you have farmer in-kind contributions in their time, in their land, and so on. And ensuring financial requirements allow risk to be shared fairly among groups. Lessons learned from England's implementation of EIP Agri was that all the liability rested on the lead partner. So only businesses of a certain size or cash flow or commercial potential could really shoulder that. Therefore, it became largely inaccessible to many producers. Project proposals assessed by farmers' advisors as well as researchers can help ensure that the real-world relevance can be identified and not just the scientific excellence alone. And suitability of method to address the farming priorities is key to assessment. Not all methods will work on the farm appropriately or tell you what you think it will. Fund group coordination and facilitation costs, including pre-application, and that's where that research starter exploratory fund I mentioned before is interesting. Evidence is compelling that facilitation throughout the life of a project is crucial to maintaining momentum and ensuring everyone is speaking the same language, as it were. and work in the Horizon 2020 project liaison described repeatedly that it was crucial to catalyse the innovation potential in farmers and growers and maintain power balances across the research lifetime as well. Public investment should deliver both public and commercial value. Where earlier I talked about the focus on precision agriculture and digital, these were largely with commercial interests, as it's arguably easier perhaps to quantify the potential return on investment than a longer-term farmer-led experiment on improving soil health could be, for example. And a big part that must change and be really well thought about is investing in shared data and knowledge exchange infrastructure. It's vital that, particularly for the UK, but it applies to many other countries as well, that knowledge is defragmented and not just a vague hope that it would eventually disperse and land and be utilised. So I hope that gave you a good sense of the direction of travel and kept to time for the UK, England in particular, as it transitions away from European agricultural policy. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to questions in a short while. Thank you.